A Chinese company just built a car that hits 300 miles an hour, and another one you can buy, brand new, for $10,000. Last year, a single Chinese shipyard built more ships than the United States has built since the end of World War II. Solar panels are pouring out of China so cheaply that people in Europe are using them as garden fencing, because the panel costs less than the fence. And in factories where the lights stay switched off, because the robots don't need to see, human-shaped machines are already beginning to build the next generation of themselves. This is not a prediction. This is not the future. This is what actually rolled off China's production lines this year. While most of the West was still picturing cheap plastic toys in a bargain bin. The country everyone wrote off as the world's junk factory has quietly become the most advanced manufacturing power in human history, and almost nobody outside those factory walls is ready for what it means. Stay to the end, because the most unsettling thing on that list is the last one, the machine that walks. It isn't just making our products anymore, it's coming for the factories themselves. Let's start with the one number that should reframe everything you think you know. Right now, China manufactures roughly 30% of everything made on Earth. Not 30% of the cheap stuff, 30% of all manufacturing on the planet, measured by value, full stop. That is more than the United States, Japan, and Germany combined. By some measures of raw output, it's more than the next 9 countries put together. One country, nearly a third of everything the human species builds. To put that in human terms, for every 3 manufactured things on Earth, every 3 screws, circuit boards, solar cells, car doors, and steel beams, roughly 1 was made in China. And it's the trajectory that should really make you sit up. In the year 2000, China made about 6% of the world's goods, and the United States made about a quarter of them. Today, China sits near 30% and climbing. The US has slipped to around 17%, and a United Nations projection has China reaching 45% of global industrial production by 2030, while the American share falls to 11%. In a single generation, the factory of the world didn't just move, it moved to one country, and that country is still accelerating. And before you reach for the old comfort of, yes, but it's all low-end junk, hold that thought, because there are exactly 2 things China still can't do at the top level, and I'll name them near the end. Everything else on this list, they've already taken. And none of this was an accident. That's the part the West keeps missing. This was a plan, an explicit, decades-long, state-directed strategy. It started in the late 1970s, when China opened its economy and moved hundreds of millions of workers from farms into factories. Then, in 2015, Beijing put a name and a target on the ambition, a program called Made in China 2025, a blueprint to dominate 10 strategic industries of the future: robotics, electric vehicles, aerospace, advanced materials, biotech, and more. And they backed it with money on a scale no rival would match. By one estimate, China spends more than 1.5% of its entire economy on industrial policy every year, more than twice the next highest country. Direct subsidies, cheap loans, cheap land, research funding, whatever it took. The West treated manufacturing as a cost to be cut. China treated it as a war to be won, and it has been fighting that war, patiently, for a very long time. While Western boardrooms optimized for the next quarter, Beijing was building for the next quarter century. One more thing hides inside that 30%, and it's the part that reveals the real depth of it. More than half of what China's factories produce isn't finished goods at all. It's the components, the inputs, the parts that go inside everything else. Which means the phone in your pocket, the car in your driveway, the appliance in your kitchen, even the ones proudly stamped "Made in Germany" or "Made in the USA" are very likely full of Chinese parts. China isn't just the world's factory, it's the factory inside all the other factories. So that's the scale. Now here's the part that should genuinely change your mind. Because scale alone isn't the shock. Anyone can make a lot of cheap things. The shock is what they're making now, and it starts with the thing in your neighbor's driveway. Begin with cars, because this is where the old story dies fastest. For a century, the automobile was the West's crown jewel, the ultimate symbol of Detroit, of Germany, of industrial mastery. In 2025, the best-selling electric vehicle company on Earth became a Chinese firm called BYD, which most Americans have never heard of. BYD sold about 2.3 million pure electric cars in 2025. Tesla sold about 1.6 million, and its sales fell. The company, founded in Shenzhen in 1995 by a chemist with 20 employees, now outsells the company that defined the electric car. And here's what should really land. China now builds around 70% of all the electric vehicles made in the world, and inside China, nearly half of all new cars sold are already electric. But it's not just the volume, it's the quality and the price. BYD sells a small electric car called the Seagull for around $10,000, a genuinely modern EV for the price of a used economy car. And at the other extreme, a BYD supercar recently hit 496 kilometers an hour, over 300 miles per hour, making it the fastest production car ever built, from the company you'd never heard of 30 seconds ago. Cheap enough to conquer the mass market, and fast enough to embarrass the supercar establishment. That's not a company copying the West anymore. And BYD doesn't just assemble cars, it makes its own batteries, its own chips, its own motors, and even ships its cars overseas on its own fleet of cargo vessels. It offers dozens of models, where Tesla offers a handful. Its self-driving system, called God's Eye, ships on cars costing a fraction of a Tesla. One of its luxury models can float and paddle across water, another can jump off the ground on its own suspension. The only reason there isn't a $10,000 Chinese EV in every American driveway is a 100% tariff holding the door shut. But the car is just the shell. The real revolution is the thing inside it. Because inside every one of those cars is a battery, and China owns the battery. Two Chinese companies, CATL and BYD, together make more than half of all the electric vehicle batteries on the planet. CATL alone commands nearly 40% of the global market, the only battery maker on Earth with more than a 30% share. All told, China controls close to 70% of the world's EV battery supply. And this isn't the West's technology being cheaply copied. CATL has demonstrated batteries that add hundreds of miles of range in a 5-minute charge. Chinese firms lead the world in the lithium iron phosphate chemistry, now spreading across the entire industry. Here's the detail that captures it. When you buy a Tesla, a Ford, a Mercedes, or a Toyota electric car, there's a strong chance the battery, the single most expensive and important part, was made by a Chinese company. The West designs the car. China increasingly powers it. And batteries don't stop at cars. The same Chinese factories now dominate the giant batteries that store power for entire electrical grids, the technology that makes cheap solar usable after dark. Cars, homes, and whole national grids, increasingly running on cells stamped with Chinese names. And if you think that dependence stops at cars, wait until you see what's on the roofs. Solar power. This might be the most complete domination of any industry on Earth. China doesn't just make most of the world's solar panels. It makes more than 80% of every single stage of them. The raw polysilicon, the ingots, the wafers, the cells, and the finished panels. And for the deepest, most fundamental building blocks, its share is approaching 95%. There is, essentially, no such thing as a solar panel that doesn't run through China. A viral drone video last year showed an entire mountain range in China's Guizhou province, blanketed edge to edge in solar panels, stretching unbroken to the horizon. And China doesn't just build them. It now files around 65% of the world's solar patents, up from just 13% 2 decades ago. It didn't only take the factory, it took the frontier of the science itself. One Chinese factory alone produces roughly 1 out of every 7 solar panels made anywhere in the world. And the scale of production has become almost hard to describe. China can now manufacture something like a full terawatt of solar panels every year, enough, each year, to rival a huge share of the entire planet's existing power capacity. The result? The price of solar has collapsed by more than 80%. Chinese panels have become so cheap that in parts of Europe, people are literally using them as garden fencing because the panels cost less than the fence would. Solar is now, by some measures, the cheapest source of electricity in human history, and that is almost entirely because of what came out of Chinese factories. Western solar companies simply could not survive it. Major manufacturers in Germany and the United States went bankrupt trying to compete. One country now holds its hand on the tap of the world's cheapest energy. Which brings us to something smaller, and in its own way, far more alarming. Drones. Look up at almost any drone flying anywhere in the world, and you're most likely looking at a Chinese machine. A single company, DJI, controls somewhere around 90% of the global consumer drone market, and China produces roughly 80% of the world's drone components: the motors, the flight controllers, the cameras, the radios. This one stopped being just a commercial story and became a strategic one. In the war in Ukraine, drones have become one of the most decisive weapons on the battlefield, and both sides have found it nearly impossible to escape the Chinese supply chain. Ukrainian manufacturers, building drones under wartime pressure, have spent years trying to source motors and parts from anywhere but China, and mostly failed, because the alternatives barely exist. One Ukrainian drone firm described the situation with dark humor. To learn how to build the parts themselves, they paid Chinese manufacturers $10,000 for the production documents, buying the knowledge to try to escape the very supply chain that sold it to them. Even many of the drones officially cleared for the US military have been found to contain Chinese-made motors and components. When the West went to build the defining weapon of modern war, it discovered the parts bin belonged to Beijing. The country that makes the toys, it turns out, also makes the tools of war. And nowhere is that clearer than at sea. Shipbuilding. This is the one that makes military planners in Washington go quiet. China now builds more ships than the entire rest of the world combined: cargo vessels, tankers, container ships, and warships. The United States, the nation that outbuilt the world during the Second World War, now accounts for roughly 0.1% of global commercial shipbuilding. Sit with that gap for a second, and then here's the figure from a leaked US Navy intelligence briefing that made it real. China's shipbuilding capacity is estimated at around 230 times that of the United States. 230 times. Chinese shipyards can turn out over 23 million tons of ships a year. American yards, well under 100,000. By one analysis, a single Chinese shipbuilding company built more commercial vessels by tonnage in 1 year than the entire United States has built since the end of World War II. China's navy is now the largest on Earth by number of ships, and it's growing on a foundation of civilian shipyards that America simply gave away decades ago. As recently as the year 2000, China held less than 10% of global shipbuilding, while Japan and South Korea together held nearly 80%. In a single generation, China didn't just catch them, it lapped the entire world. The country that once ruled the seas by outbuilding everyone can no longer outbuild anyone. But maybe the most futuristic thing of all is what's happening inside the factories, when the lights go out. Because a growing number of Chinese factories are what the industry calls dark factories. The name is literal. These are facilities so completely automated that they can run with the lights switched off, because robots don't need to see. No workers on the floor, no shifts, no breaks, just machines, running 24 hours a day, assembling products in the dark. Chinese tech giants have built dark factories that can produce a finished smartphone roughly every second, essentially untouched by human hands. And this is all riding on an infrastructure the West can barely imagine building anymore. China has laid down over 45,000 kilometers of high-speed rail, more than the entire rest of the world combined, most of it built in a little over 15 years. Fast trains, automated ports, lights-out factories, all wired together into a manufacturing machine of a kind that has never existed before. And if all of this still feels far away, cars you can't buy, ships you'll never see, factories on the other side of the planet, here's the part sitting in your house right now. The odds are you already own more advanced Chinese manufacturing than you realize. That television brand quietly taking over American living rooms. Hisense, Chinese. Midea, now the single largest home appliance maker on Earth, Chinese. The company that owns the all-American sounding GE appliances, that's Haier, Chinese. The apps that reshaped global shopping and social media, TikTok, Temu, Shein, all Chinese. The drone overhead, the power bank in your bag, the robot vacuum on your floor, quite possibly the battery in your car. This isn't a distant future arriving someday, it's a present that already arrived, wearing familiar logos, while everyone kept picturing the bargain bin. You're not waiting for the Chinese century, you're already living in its opening chapter, and most of the labels never bothered to tell you. So, that's what's coming out of the factories. Cars, batteries, solar, drones, ships, and factories that run themselves. Now for the harder question. What does it actually mean? And is China really as unstoppable as all of this sounds? Here's where honesty matters, because the truth is more interesting than the hype, in both directions. China is not 10 feet tall. Remember those two things I told you to hold on to? Here they are. First, the most advanced computer chips. When it comes to cutting-edge semiconductors, the tiny brains inside the best phones, computers, and AI systems, China still lags years behind Taiwan, South Korea, and the United States, and it depends on Western and allied technology to make them. That's the West's single biggest point of leverage. The machines that carve those cutting-edge chips are so fiendishly complex that essentially one company in the Netherlands, ASML, makes them, and the most advanced ones are blocked from sale to China. The chips themselves are mostly manufactured by a single company in Taiwan. It is the narrowest, most fragile choke point in the entire modern economy, and it's the main card the West still holds. And second, commercial aircraft. Building a large, safe passenger jet and its engines is still one of the few things China cannot yet fully do alone, which is why Boeing and Airbus still rule the skies. So there are cracks in the wall, and there's more. China's factories are so productive that they now make far more than the world can absorb, creating gluts, price collapses, and waves of bankruptcies even inside China. Its population is aging and beginning to shrink. Its economy carries enormous debt. Some of that solar and steel dominance was bought with heavy state subsidies and a real environmental cost. Much of that clean solar is still made using electricity from coal. And that breakneck rise carried a real human cost. Grueling factory conditions, punishing hours, and serious international concern about labor practices in some of the regions where the raw materials are refined. This is not a fairy tale of effortless progress. It was forged hard, and not always cleanly. This is not a flawless machine. It is a powerful one, with genuine weaknesses. But here is why none of that should make the West relax. Because the direction of travel is unmistakable. 20 years ago, China made cheap toys. Then it made our electronics. Then it took cars, batteries, solar, and ships. Every decade, it climbs higher up the ladder of value, moving from the things nobody wanted to make toward the things everybody depends on. And that brings us, finally, to the thing I promised you at the very beginning, the thing that walks. Humanoid robots, machines built in the shape of a person, designed to work in a world built for people. This is the newest frontier, and China has sprinted straight to the front of it. A Chinese company called Unitree, alongside a rival named Agibot, now leads the world in humanoid robot shipments. To grasp how lopsided it already is, in a recent year, Unitree alone shipped roughly 36 times more humanoid robots than the American frontrunners, Tesla and Figure, combined. And China is doing to robots exactly what it did to solar panels and electric cars, driving the price through the floor. Where a Western humanoid robot might cost a small fortune, Chinese companies are already selling capable humanoids for around the price of a cheap car, and the price is falling fast. Output of Chinese humanoid robots is projected to nearly double again in 2026 alone. And Beijing is pouring state money into it exactly the way it once did, into solar and electric cars, the same playbook that turned those industries into global monopolies, now aimed squarely at the human-shaped machine. The leading Chinese maker is already building toward a capacity of tens of thousands of humanoids every year. Now put the whole picture together, and you'll see why this is the ending. China already dominates the making of things, and now it is racing to build the robots, cheap, capable, mass-produced humanoid workers that will go into those dark factories and make everything else. Robots, building robots, in factories that need no lights. That is the loop closing. That is a country trying to automate the very foundation of industrial power itself. The thing coming off the line isn't just a product anymore. It's the worker. So step all the way back, and here's what this really means. For 30 years, the West told itself a comforting story, that manufacturing was low value, dirty, yesterday's work, something to offshore to somebody poorer, while the West kept the important parts, the design, the brands, the finance. China heard that same story and drew the opposite conclusion. It decided that whoever makes things, actually, physically makes them, controls the technology, the supply chains, the jobs, and ultimately the power. And it spent 30 patient years and enormous state effort proving itself right. The China shock that hollowed out Western factory towns in the 2000s was never a one-time event. It was the first wave. And each wave has climbed higher than the last. The first took our furniture and our toys. The second took our electronics. The third is taking our cars, our energy, and our ships. The fourth, the one just beginning, is reaching for robotics, aviation, and the chips themselves. The West is finally reacting. Tariffs on Chinese cars, national programs to rebuild semiconductor plants, subsidies to lure factories home, bans on Chinese technology in sensitive systems. But reshoring a supply chain takes a decade, and China spent 3 decades building its lead. You cannot cram 30 years of industrial build-out into a single political cycle. The response has begun. Whether it began in time is the real question. The difference now is that China isn't taking the low end anymore. It's taking the electric car, the battery, the solar panel, the ship, and reaching for the robot and the chip. This is not a reason for panic, and it is definitely not a reason for hatred. It is a reason to see clearly. The country that makes the most things gets to shape the century, its rules, its prices, its balance of power. And right now, by an enormous margin, that country is China. And most of the West is still picturing a bargain bin. The factories aren't cheap anymore. They aren't dirty anymore. In many cases, they're the most advanced on Earth, and the lights are off, and the robots are already walking in. The West doesn't have to fear what's coming out of China's factories, but it can no longer afford to look away from it. So, which one genuinely surprised you most? The $10,000 supercar maker, the 230-to-1 shipyards, or the robots building robots in the dark? Tell me in the comments. And if this changed the picture in your head, subscribe. We follow where the world is actually being built, every single time.